So if you're coming from Adobe like I am, then Fusion is the part of Resolve that's similar to Adobe After Effects. Similar in the sense that it's meant for visual effects and motion graphics. Now, Fusion is actually a lot different in terms of the way that you work in it because it's node-based, whereas After Effects is layer-based. Node-based compositing can feel pretty daunting when you're starting off because it's a very different workflow to layer-based compositing. Working with nodes at the start made absolutely no sense to me. I would always just ask, but where's the timeline? And that's the thing that no one told me. You still work with a timeline in Fusion, and you still work with keyframes on a timeline. The interface is just laid out differently, and you don't use a timeline like you typically would. You still use the timeline view to position where your clips and keyframes sit in relation to each other in time, just like you would in After Effects, but the order in which your clips are stacked in your Fusion timeline doesn't affect your final image. That doesn't actually matter in Fusion. It's the way that the nodes are connected to each other in the node area that affects your final image. Now, don't worry if you have no idea what I'm talking about. I'll be showing you examples in the coming lessons so that you can get a better understanding of exactly what I mean. Now, one thing I want to let you guys know now is that the nodes we work with in Fusion are much different from the nodes we're going to be using in the Color tab, which we're going to be learning about later on in this course. Nodes in the Color tab are much easier to understand, and in my opinion, things just make sense right away. Whereas the node space within Fusion requires you to have an understanding of the rules on how you assemble things in the Fusion node area before you can actually start doing things. It's not as intuitive at first, in my opinion, but once you understand the foundations and how things work, then it starts to make a lot more sense, and then you start to understand how much more beneficial it is to be able to view your entire project from the perspective of a node tree versus a bunch of layers in a timeline. These are two examples of the same project. On the left, we have a Fusion node tree, and on the right, we have After Effects layers. From my node tree, I can see every single element of my composition, including effects, resizing, and masks, without even having to open up a single layer. Whereas on the After Effects project, I need to open up each individual layer to get access to the masks, effects, and any other kind of changes I've made on each layer, which is a lot more time consuming in the long run. Now, this is a fairly simple transition, so doing this in a layer-based setting might not be that bad, but once things start to get complicated and you're working with a ton of media effects, masks, and more, then the node style of editing can allow you to work much more efficiently. Personally, I prefer the node-based workflow even if what I'm doing is very simple because I've learned the foundations and I can go into Fusion and do whatever I want pretty quickly. Another thing to keep in mind is that After Effects is a completely separate program to Premiere Pro. And although Adobe has something called Dynamic Link, so you can quickly open up files from Premiere in After Effects, I would never end up using it because I always ran into issues when doing anything more complex than basic title tracking and things like that. I would always have to export the files I want to play with in Premiere and then create a whole new project in After Effects and then play around from there. With Fusion, I no longer need to do that. Fusion is built into DaVinci and it's super easy for me to get in there and start doing some more advanced compositing work. Now, one last thing I want to mention. When I first got into Fusion, I would get extremely frustrated and unmotivated simply because I didn't understand things right away. I want you to know that it's okay if you feel the same way and you're not alone. To many of you, this is a new method of video editing and it's more of a learning curve. But the key is to study the foundations of how it works, stay consistent, and experiment yourself. I personally learn the fastest when I go into the program and try things myself after learning. But thankfully for you, I've compiled all of the best information on the internet about how to get started in Fusion within this course. So I hope you guys enjoy this series of videos on Fusion, and I hope that you end up loving Fusion just as much as I do.